Nobody saw it coming. Just a few months ago, almost every poll, every political expert, every headline had Pierre Poilievre standing on the edge of a huge victory. He was the man who had tapped into the frustration building up across Canada. Soaring grocery bills, housing prices that felt out of control, wages that couldn't keep up. People were angry, tired, and ready for something new. The ruling Liberals, weighed down by years of scandals, rising living costs, and promises they couldn't seem to keep, looked like they were about to be shown the door. The story seemed already written. The Conservatives would sweep in and the country would take a sharp new direction. But then something shifted, something nobody fully expected. It didn't happen all at once. It was more like a slow, rumbling change, almost hidden at first, but powerful enough to turn everything upside down. A few events on the world stage started creeping into Canada's conversation. The aggressive moves from the United States under Donald Trump's second term started to make Canadians uneasy. His talk about new tariffs, threats over energy deals, and even wild remarks about annexation made people stop and think, was now really the time to roll the dice on something completely new? Slowly, questions began to grow. People started wondering not just who could make life cheaper, but who could actually keep the country safe, steady, and respected on the world stage. And that's where the story started to change. Not long. Before the election chaos started, Canada was already standing at a crossroads, even if many people didn't realize it yet. Life felt heavier. Everyday things like filling your gas tank or buying groceries were suddenly taking a bigger bite out of paychecks. Young people were losing hope of ever owning a home. Families who used to feel secure were now budgeting down to the last dollar. The country was tired, not just physically but emotionally too. After nearly a decade of Liberal rule, led by Justin Trudeau, it felt like a lot of the promises of a better future had dried up. And then came the biggest sign that change was really on the horizon. Justin Trudeau announced he was stepping down. It hit the political world like a thunderclap. Here was a leader who once captured global attention, young, energetic, seen as a fresh face in a world of old politics, now quietly stepping away. His exit wasn't just the end of a person's leadership, it was the end of an era. Suddenly the Liberal Party, once a symbol of hope for so many, looked lost. Into this space stepped Mark Carney. To some Canadians, he was just a name they had, heard now and then in business news. But to others, especially those who paid attention during the 2008 financial crash or the Brexit mess in the UK, Carney was a heavyweight, a man who had walked through global economic fires and come out stronger. He wasn't flashy. He didn't crack jokes on late-night TV, but he had something even more important, a reputation for knowing what he was doing when everything seemed to be falling apart. Still, it wasn't smooth sailing. Carney faced a tired, skeptical public. Many voters weren't looking for another expert. They were hungry for someone who spoke their anger out loud, someone who seemed to get how hard life had become. That's why Pierre Poilievre, with his sharp words and fiery speeches, was doing so well. He pointed to the cost of living crisis, the soaring house prices, the broken promises, and he made it personal. He made it simple. His message hit people where they lived, in their wallets, at their dinner tables, in their worries about the future. It seemed clear. Canadians would turn away from the old guard and hand the keys over to someone who promised a clean break. Almost every major newspaper, from Financial Times to Vox, laid out the growing discontent with the Liberals. The Guardian even reported how the Trudeau era had exhausted the public's patience, especially in the suburbs and smaller cities that often decide elections. If you asked the average person on the street what they thought was going to happen, the answer was easy. Poilievre was on track to win, big, but under the surface there was something else brewing. A quiet worry that maybe anger wasn't enough. Maybe shouting about broken systems wouldn't be enough when real threats, like the ones brewing just south of the border, came knocking. Canadians have always seen themselves as peaceful, steady, and careful when it comes to major change. And now, in the middle of all the rage about groceries and gas, a bigger question started slipping into the conversation. Who could actually protect the country if the world turned even more Unstable? The backdrop of this election wasn't just grocery bills and housing markets. It was something bigger. It was about who could be trusted when the ground shook, and whether the country would choose anger or experience to guide them through the storm. At first, the election seemed like it would be fought over the same old issues: jobs, healthcare, taxes, and who could make life more affordable. That's what everyone expected. That's what the news talked about. But something outside of Canada's borders started to creep into the story, and it changed everything. Across the southern border, the United States was going through its own wild storm. Donald Trump, back in the White House after a stunning comeback, wasn't wasting any time. He came in swinging, threatening new tariffs on Canadian steel and lumber, promising to rework trade deals that had been seen as safe for decades. And then came something even more shocking. In one of his late-night rallies, Trump made a wild remark about reclaiming parts of Canadian land for American energy needs. Most Canadians rolled their eyes at first. Trump was known for saying outrageous things, but the more he talked, the less like a joke it seemed. People started wondering, was this just bluster, or was it a warning of things to come? Suddenly, the whole tone of the election began to shift. It wasn't just about who could lower grocery prices anymore. It was about who could stand up to a bully, who could protect Canada's economy, its borders, its very sense of identity. Pierre Poilievre, who had built his whole campaign around tearing down the Liberal government and promising change, now found himself on strange ground. Critics started asking, could he really go toe-to-toe with someone like Trump? Could a man who had spent years fighting Ottawa insiders handle the real pressure of global politics? Mark Carney, on the other hand, began to look different under this new light. He wasn't loud. He didn't throw punches in interviews. But he had spent years negotiating with world leaders, calming financial storms, and earning respect in rooms where deals were made and futures decided. He wasn't exciting, but maybe in a moment like this that was a good thing. People who had tuned out started tuning back in. Debates that once sounded like background noise now felt urgent. Vox ran stories explaining how deeply connected Canada's economy was to the United States and how vulnerable it could be under new trade threats. The Guardian covered rising fears among Canadian farmers and factory workers, worried that tariffs could destroy their livelihoods overnight. Financial Times pointed out that in times of global stress, voters often turn to leaders who seem steady, not those who seem risky. Town halls across the country started buzzing with new kinds of questions. People weren't just asking about healthcare anymore. They were asking, what happens if Trump slaps 30% tariffs on Canadian goods? What happens if the U.S. walks away from defense promises? What happens if the old friendship between the two countries starts to break? It wasn't something any party had planned for. It wasn't in their talking points. But it was real. Fear, not just frustration, was now part of the election conversation. And that fear changed everything. The election wasn't just about fixing a few broken things at home. It was now about choosing the person who could defend Canada when bigger storms rolled in from beyond its borders. In a country known for keeping its cool, this sudden wave of uncertainty started to move voters in ways no one had predicted. Quietly, at first, but gaining strength with every passing day, the ground under the campaign started to shift. And once it started, there was no stopping it. When Mark Carney first stepped into the race, a lot of people didn't pay much attention. He wasn't a household name like Trudeau or a fire starter like Poilievre. He spoke carefully. He wore simple suits. He didn't throw out big promises or pick fights on stage. In a world full of loud leaders, Carney was quiet. Maybe too quiet, or so it seemed at first. But behind that calm voice was something people were starting to crave: real experience. Carney wasn't just another politician. He was the man who had kept the Bank of Canada steady during the 2008 crash, when the world economy was falling apart. He was the one Britain had called when Brexit threatened to wreck their markets. Carney knew how to hold the line when everyone else was panicking. And now, with Trump back in the White House and trouble brewing, that kind of steady hand suddenly mattered more than ever. At town halls, Carney didn't shout. He didn't make wild promises. He talked about hard choices, about standing firm, under pressure. about protecting Canada's economy and defending its place in the world. And slowly, people started listening. He framed the election not just as a fight for lower prices, but as a battle for Canada's future. He asked voters, "Who do you trust when everything is on the line? A man with slogans, or someone who has actually faced global crises and won?" Poilievre tried to brush him off as just another elitist, but the attacks didn't land the same way anymore. Canadians were watching the news from the US, hearing the threats, feeling the uncertainty. They didn't just want anger. They wanted someone who looked like they could actually protect them if things got worse. Carney's team understood this shift. They stopped trying to fight on Poilievre's turf. They didn't match his anger. They offered something different. Calm, control, and competence. Where Poilievre promised to tear everything down, Carney promised to hold things together. The change in mood wasn't explosive. It was slow, like a tide pulling at the shore. One day it was a few undecided voters saying they were giving Carney another look. The next it was a string of endorsements from mayors, former ministers, even business leaders. In key battlegrounds like Toronto suburbs and Atlantic Canada, momentum started to build. By the time final debates rolled around, the contrast was clear. Poilievre looked sharp, but edgy. Carney looked serious, measured, like a man who already knew the weight of hard decisions. In a world spinning faster and faster, Carney's calm started to feel less boring and more like exactly what the moment demanded. Without shouting, without drama, Mark Carney had begun to rise. And the election, once thought to be a landslide for the Conservatives, was now wide open. The polls said it would be close, but nobody expected how fast it would turn. It started in Ontario. In places like Richmond Hill and Brampton, voters who were leaning Conservative started pulling back. Not because they loved the Liberals, but because fear had crept in. Fear that anger wasn't enough to lead a country through a storm. In Quebec, the Bloc was supposed to sweep big parts of the province. They didn't. Older voters, normally solid Bloc supporters, shifted quietly toward the Liberals. They didn't trust the chaos coming from the South. They didn't want to gamble with their future. Atlantic Canada told the same story. Seats that were supposed to flip blue stayed red. Some ridings even swung harder toward Carney than anyone thought possible. Even out west, where Conservatives usually run up the score, cracks started to show. Not everywhere, but in a few key suburban ridings around Vancouver, the shift was real. Quiet, but real. Everywhere the same pattern. Fear beat anger. Calm beat noise. Political veterans said later they felt it the week before voting. Town halls started filling with questions about stability, not slogans. Local papers, even some usually critical of the Liberals, urged caution. One riding flipped, then another, then another. By the time election night arrived, it was clear. The wave everyone expected wasn't coming. It wasn't even a wave anymore, it was a reversal. One seat at a time, one street at a time, Canadians were choosing differently. And nobody, not the pollsters, not the pundits, not even the parties, saw it coming until it was too late. The night started the way everyone thought it would. Early numbers had the Conservatives ahead. News anchors nodded along. It looked like the script was playing out. Then the numbers shifted. Ontario didn't break blue like expected. It stayed stubbornly red in key ridings. Brampton, Mississauga, parts of Ottawa, not flipping. Quebec didn't deliver the Bloc surge. Instead, Liberal gains, small, but enough to make a difference. By the time the Atlantic results fully rolled in, it was clear Carney had stopped the bleeding. Not just survived. He had built a wall Poilievre couldn't climb. The Conservative war room started leaking panic. Seats they counted on were slipping away, not losing by much, but losing. By midnight, it wasn't just about winning or losing anymore. It was about shock. Carney wasn't just competitive. He was ahead. A clear, stable path to government, maybe even a majority if things broke right. Poilievre came out late. No victory speech, no real concession either. Just a tight jaw, a few short words about fighting on. Carney came out too. Calm, serious, no gloating. He talked about responsibility, about steady hands, about rebuilding trust. The maps on TV screens, all night turning bluer than anyone had predicted, told the real story. A stunning reversal. A country that almost chose anger, and at the last second chose caution instead. The election of the new government in Canada marks a significant turning point, not just for the country but also for its position on the global stage. On the domestic front, there are several pressing issues that the government will need to tackle, with economic recovery being at the top of the list. The country, like many others, is still recovering from the impacts of the pandemic, so finding ways to rebuild the economy, create jobs, and support businesses will be key. Healthcare will also remain a major concern, with ongoing debates around how to improve access and affordability for all Canadians. Climate change is another challenge that will demand attention. The government will likely need to balance economic growth with the need to take bold action on environmental issues, finding solutions that protect both the economy and the planet. Internationally, Canada's relationship with the United States will likely play a crucial role in shaping the country's future. Given the strong economic and political ties between the two nations, it's reasonable to expect that the new government will focus on maintaining a cooperative relationship with the U.S., especially in areas like trade, security, and environmental policy. However, Canada's global role extends beyond its southern neighbor. The new leadership may look to strengthen ties with other nations, focusing on international cooperation, human rights, and addressing global challenges like climate change and security. Looking ahead, this election shows that the political landscape in Canada is evolving. Voters are paying closer attention to issues that directly affect their lives, such as healthcare, the economy, and climate action. The lessons from this election could indicate that future governments will need to adapt, engaging more deeply with citizens' concerns and being flexible in how they approach the country's biggest challenges. This shift may also mean that political parties will have to rethink their traditional strategies and find new ways to connect with voters, particularly younger generations. As we look back on the election and what it means for Canada, it's important to hear from you. Your voice matters in shaping the future of this country. What do you think about the outcome and the changes it might bring? How do you feel about the new government's plans for economic recovery, healthcare, and the environment? Share your thoughts with us and let's keep this conversation going. If you want to stay updated and dive deeper into political analyses like this one, don't forget to subscribe. We'll keep bringing you the latest news and updates on what's happening in politics. And as we wrap up, think about this. In a world where things can change so quickly, how can we, as citizens, help shape the future of our democracy? The power is in our hands to make a difference.